All Tomorrows, a billion-year chronicle of the myriad species and mixed fortunes of man, by C.M. Kosemen. A reading, Part 3. Temptor. In the Temptor's case, the remodelling was done with an almost artistic enthusiasm. How they managed to survive in their bizarre form was not clear. Their ancestors were used as sessile decoration, and through some miracle of adaptation, they had endured. No human would have recognized them as their descendants. The females were beaked cones of flesh some 2 meters tall, rooted in soil like grotesque carnivorous plants. The males, on the other hand, resembled contorted bipedal monkeys. Unlike their mates, they were perfectly ambulatory. Dozens of them ran around the females' mounds like so many imps. Some would gather food, others would clean the females, while others would stand guard for danger. Although their actions looked purposeful, the males had no will of their own. In Temptor society, females controlled everything. Using a combination of vocal and pheromonal signals, they guided the masculine hordes into any number of menial tasks, while mating with the strongest, the most obedient, and the dumbest, to produce even better drones. On certain periods, they would also give birth to a few precious females, who would be carried away by subservient males to root themselves. It was a terribly efficient hegemony that would certainly give rise to civilization in a matter of centuries, had fate not intervened. As a stray comet obliterated the Temptor's mound forests, one of humanity's best chances for re-emergence was cruelly swept away. Bone Crusher. Through the deliberate modifications of Q and the blind moulding of evolution, the heavens came to be populated with creatures that would put the myths of their ancestors to shame. Their ancestors were pint-sized pets of Q that were bred for the dazzling colours of their tooth-derived beaks. When their masters left, most of these pampered creatures died, with no one or nothing left to take care of them. But some, belonging to the hardiest breeds, survived. In less than a geological eye blink of a few million years, the descendants of such creatures radiated into the evolutionary vacuum of their garden world. One lineage led to a profusion of human herbivores. These were preyed upon by a variety of enamel-beaked raptors, each evolved to deal with a specific prey. Among these generalized niches were entire assemblages of specialized animals, resembling anything from ibis-billed swamp sifters to splendorous forms with bizarre crests that flared out of their toothy beaks. There were even secondarily sentient forms, in the shape of the ogre-like bone crushers. To an observer of today, they would indeed be the stuff of nightmares, 3 meters tall and hairy, sporting vicious thumb claws and enormous beaks that suited their scavenging diet. Despite their shortcomings, these corpse-eating primitives were one of the first species to attain intelligence and, although primitive, a level of civilization. All of this proved the fallacy of human prejudice in the post-human galaxy. A creature could feed on putrefying meat, stink like a grave, and express its affection by defecating on others, but it might as well be your own grandchild and the last hope of mankind. In eventuality, however, not even the bone crushers fulfilled this promise. Their dependency on carrion for food limited their population severely, and their medieval civilizations crumbled after a few uneventful millennia. Colonials. Their world had given the toughest resistance against the Q onslaught, so tough, in fact, that they had turned back 2 successive waves of the invaders, only to succumb to the third. The Q, with their twisted sense of justice, wanted to make them pay. Even extinction would be too light a punishment for resisting the star gods. The humans of the rogue world needed a sentence that would remind them of their humiliation for generations to come. So they were made into disembodied cultures of skin and muscle, connected by a skimpy network of the most basic nerves. They were employed as living filtering devices, subsisting on the waste products of Q civilization like mats of cancer cells. and just to witness and suffer their wretched fate, their eyes, together with their consciousness, were retained. For 40 million years they suffered. Generation after generation were born into the most miserable of lives while absorbing the pain of all that they were going through. When the Q left, they hoped for a quick extinction, but their lowliness had also made them efficient survivors. Unchecked by the Q, the Colonials spread across the planet in quilt-like fields of human flesh. After an eternity of tortured lives, the human fields tasted something that could almost be described as hope. Flyers. They were not uncommon at all in the domain of Q. At least a dozen worlds sported human-derived flying species of one kind or another. Most resembled the bats or the pterosaurs of the bygone past, dancing through the ether like angels, or demons, depending on the point of view. There were a few bizarre kinds relied on swollen gas glands for flotation as well. Sadly, most of these creatures were already too specialized to be anything but flyers. They had forsaken their humanity for the conquest of the sky. They had little potential for further radiation beyond their limited roles. The only exception proved out to be a monkey-like species that flew on wing membranes stretched across the last 2 fingers. Their advantage was a unique turbine-like heart, artificially developed during the regime of the Q. No other human flyer in the galaxy had such an adaptation. The starfish-shaped organ sat in the middle of their chests, directly funneling oxygen from the lungs to the bloodstream in a supremely efficient way. This meant that the flyers could develop energy-consuming adaptations, such as large brains, without having to give up their power of flight. Not that the flyers were going to reclaim their sentience right away. Instead, they literally exploded into skies, filling the heavens with anything from bomber-sized sailors to impossibly fast predators that raced with sound. Their world was pristine, and there were plenty of niches to play in. Intelligence could wait a little more. Hand flappers. Some flying post-humans reapproached sentience in an entirely different way. Without the augmented metabolisms or the gravitational advantages of their siblings on distant planets, they had no choice but to give up their power of flight in order to develop further. The hand flappers were one such species. Their wings, once used for butterfly-like flutters in the unearthly gardens of Q, had shrunken and reverted back into their manual condition. Their legs were likewise readapted, but they bore a splayed awkwardness from their perching ancestry. Only a singular and almost sadistically simple flaw held them back from developing civilization. In the course of their secondary atrophy, the wings of the hand flappers had become useless as hands as well. Their flag-like appendages were very useful in signalling and mating dances, but they couldn't hurl missiles, construct shelter, or even manufacture basic stone tools. All they could do with their useless hands was to display each other's sexual availability, so the hand flappers did just that, flashing and dancing their way to oblivion. Blind folk. When the Q came, they dug in deep. Inside several continent-sized shelters under the besieged world, they waited for the invaders to pass them by. It was a futile gamble. The Q located the shelter caves and remade their inhabitants without effort. The shelters became home to an entirely different ecology, a realm of perpetual darkness fueled by the trickle of water and nutrients from the world outside. A surprisingly complex ecology developed on this scant resource. Gigantic pale insects, the descendants of common household pests, competed with Dali-esque birds and rodents over fields of overgrown fungi. Predators were not uncommon. Almost crocodilian fish patrolled the underground streams, and vast blind bats, echolocating with unnerving precision, took their toll on the residents of the cave floor. The kilometre-high ceilings of the shelters glowed in the dark with protean constellations of bioluminescent fungi, and in some cases, animals. People were present here as well, albeit in unfamiliar forms. They were more often heard than seen, as they had tried to find their way in the dark with banshee-like screams. These albino troglodytes lived in a realm where sound and touch, not sight, was the gateway of perception. They had developed long tactile fingers, enormous whiskers and mobile ears to live in the dark. Where their eyes should have seen, there was nothing but a patch of haunting, flawlessly smooth skin. Their perfect adaptation to the world of darkness had erased the most basic feature of human recognition. As adapted as they were doomed. Before the blind folk could develop any kind of intelligence to crawl out of their geographical graves, the glacial constriction of their world's continental plates snuffed out the shelters one by one. Lopsiders. The Q were grotesquely creative in their redesign of the human worlds. One group of misfortunate souls they transported to a planet with 36 times the amount of normal gravity and made them over for life in this bizarrely inhospitable realm. The results of these experiments resembled nightmare sketchings of Bosch, Dali or Picasso. They looked like cripples squashed between sheets of glass. 3 out of their 4 limbs had become paddle-like organs for crawling. Only one of their arms remained as a spindly tool of manipulation. This singular wizened limb also doubled as an extra sensor, like the antenna of an insect. Their faces were different horrors altogether. All pretensions of symmetry, the hallmark of terrestrial animals from jawless fish onwards, were completely and utterly done away with. One bulging eye stared directly upward while the other scanned ahead in the direction of the creature's vertically opening jaws. The ears were likewise distorted. Monstrous as they looked, these X-Men thrived in their heavy gravity environment. Once again, there was the usual explosion of species into every available niche, and the Lopsiders consolidated their chances for a renewed sentience. Striders. While the Lopsiders were redesigned to live under extreme gravity, another species had been adapted for life under the exact opposite conditions, on a Jovian moon with 1/5 of Earth's gravity. It was a world of wonders, where even the grass grew almost 10 meters tall and the trees were almost beyond belief, towering to sizes attained only by the skyscrapers of antiquity. In these surreal forests lived equally spectacular fauna, the descendants of pets, pests and livestock of humans, who in turn had been reduced to animosity as well. One could see them in the league-tall forests, almost dancing among the trees as they reared higher and higher to browse. Their arms, legs and necks had been stretched impossibly thin, great flaps of skin blossomed throughout their bodies to dispense waste heat. Sometimes they would even change their colour in order to reflect light and keep cool. Overheating was a great problem for their grotesquely tall, thin bodies. Although imposing, these Geocometian wraiths were overdeveloped as to be sickeningly fragile. Even on their gravitationally forgiving world, a fall could shatter their bones, and slipping down from a branch would prove to be fatal. Sometimes on the open plains, even a strong wind could bring them down like the toppling masts. They survived entirely due to the merciful conditions of their garden world, which were about to change drastically. About 2 million years after the Q left their towering works of human art, a lineage of fearsome predators evolved from the terrestrial poultry that had gone feral on the planet. Resembling attenuated versions of their dinosaur ancestors, the predators swept through the garden world like wildfires, extinguishing any species too fragile to escape or resist. The peaceful, delicate striders were among the first to go. Parasites. Humanity had diverged into 2 separate lineages on their world. On one hand, there were several races of almost australopithecine cripples, degraded by the Q for managing to turn back their initial wave of invasion. Yet simple atavism was too light a punishment for them. Their twisted relatives, the Parasites, made up the second part of their sentence. There were actually several kinds of parasitic ex-people, ranging from tortoise-sized ambulatory vampires to the more common fist-sized variety that lived attached to their hosts. There was even a tiny endoparasitic kind that infested the wombs of their female victims like ghastly living abortions. All of these evolutionary tortures were played out under the careful scrutiny of the Q for 40 million years. The punishment was so baroque, so elaborate that most of the artificial parasite-host relationships died out when the Q left. Some submen learned to cleanse their tick-like relatives by drowning, burning, or even eating them. Others, like the vaginal parasites, died out as their aggressive method of parasitism effectively sterilized their hosts. Yet one or two varieties did manage to cling on to their hosts with abdominal suckers, muscular gripping limbs, and sterile, pain-soothing saliva. But their success did not lie entirely in the strength of their parasitical advantages. They also learnt to regulate their dumb hosts, not killing them by over-infestation and thus ensuring their own long-term survival as well. In any case, totally single-sided relations were rare in any ecology, natural or artificial. In millennial cycles, the cousin species' vicious parasitism began to give way into something more beneficial for both sides. Fingerfishers. Their ancestors were trapped on an archipelago world, a planet sprinkled with many small continents and countless islands over interconnected networks of calm, swallow seas. Like a magnified Aegean, this place was a terrestrial paradise in many respects, except that after the Q, no minds were left to enjoy it. On this vacant biosphere, evolution was quick to begin her blind, unpredictable dance. Once feral, the descendants of degenerate humans adapted themselves to every available niche, no matter how exotic, how outlandish. One group learnt to pluck fish from the lazy shores. Millennia passed and they settled more into their piscatorial lifestyle. Elongated fingers became ambulatory fishhooks, teeth modified for a generalized diet became needle-like affairs, lined up neatly in a long, thin muzzle. In less than a few million years, the fingerfishers established themselves as a prominent lineage. There was scarcely a beach, an island, or an estuary that was devoid of their pale, lanky forms. As prolific as they were, the fishers were still no better than animals. Their humanity would come only after another spasm of outlandish adaptations.